You have waited for an apology that never came. Not from a stranger, from someone who knew exactly what they did. Someone who watched you carry the weight of what happened, the confusion, the hurt, the slow erosion of trust, and said nothing. Or worse, said something that looked like an apology but was structured, on closer inspection, entirely around themselves. How hard this was for them. How you misunderstood their intentions. How the situation was more complicated than you were making it. And you stood there holding the damage they caused, while they explained why they shouldn't have to acknowledge it. The standard explanation for this is simple. The person is selfish, arrogant. They don't care about you enough to apologize. Their ego is too large to admit fault. That explanation feels right, and it captures something real. But it is not the complete mechanism. And the part it misses is the part that actually explains the behavior, including why the non-apology is so consistent, so total, and so impervious to evidence that harm was caused. Because the research shows that people who cannot apologize are not, in most cases, people who have evaluated the situation and concluded they were right. They are people whose nervous system has registered the apology itself as a threat, not as a social obligation, not as a kindness to be extended, as a genuine, neurologically registered danger that the system will organize every available resource to avoid. Once you understand what that threat is, the behavior stops looking like arrogance. It starts looking like something more specific and considerably more difficult to change. Let's establish what an apology actually requires at the psychological level, because this is where the mechanism becomes visible. A genuine apology requires 4 things simultaneously: the acknowledgement that harm was caused, the acceptance of responsibility for causing it, the perspective taking that allows the person to hold the experience of the one they harmed, and the willingness to be seen, specifically to be seen as someone who caused harm. That last requirement is the one that breaks the system. For most people, being seen as someone who caused harm is uncomfortable but survivable. The discomfort is real, but the self-concept can absorb it, because the self-concept is stable enough to hold the information that I did something wrong without collapsing into the conclusion that I am something wrong. For the person who cannot apologize, that distinction between doing wrong and being wrong does not function as a reliable buffer. The acknowledgement of harmful behavior does not stay contained to the specific action. It threatens to confirm something far more total, something about the self at its foundation, something the entire behavioral architecture of this person's life is organized around never having to confirm that something is shame. Psychologist June Tangney's research on shame and guilt established a distinction that is essential to understanding this pattern, and that most people's intuitions about these emotions get completely backwards. Guilt and shame feel similar from the inside. Both are painful. Both are social emotions triggered by the perception of having done something wrong. But their targets are structurally different. Guilt is the feeling that I did something bad. The target is the behavior, the action, the specific thing that caused harm. Guilt is painful, but it is also functional. It motivates repair. It produces the impulse to acknowledge, to apologize, to make the situation right. Because the behavior is the problem, and behavior can be changed. Shame is the feeling that I am something bad. The target is not the behavior. It is the self, the entire person. Shame does not say, "That was a harmful thing I did." Shame says, "That harmful thing I did is evidence of what I fundamentally am." When an apology is requested from a person who is prone to shame rather than guilt, a person whose internal architecture does not reliably separate what they do from what they are, The apology is not experienced as a request to acknowledge a behavior. It is experienced as a demand to confirm the worst thing they believe about themselves, and the nervous system's response to that demand is not consideration, it is defense. Imagine a structure built on a foundation that the builder knows, at some level, not always consciously, is unstable, cracked, insufficient to hold the weight above it. The builder does not advertise this. They build walls around the foundation. They reinforce the exterior. They make the structure look, from every visible angle, more solid than it is. And when someone comes too close to the foundation, when someone asks a question or makes an observation or requests an acknowledgement that would require examining what is underneath, the builder does not invite inspection. They redirect. They fortify. They attack the credibility of the person asking, not because they are certain the foundation is fine, because they cannot afford to find out it isn't. The non-apology is the fortification, the counter-accusation. You're too sensitive, you misunderstood, you always do this, is the redirection. The elaborate justification for why the harm was not harm is the wall built around the crack. None of this is primarily conscious. The person is not sitting down and calculating, if I apologize, my self-concept will collapse. The defensive response is automatic. It is generated by a system that has learned, over a long time, that the examination of wrongdoing produces an experience, shame, that is genuinely unbearable, and that avoiding that experience requires any available defensive maneuver. The apology is not being withheld out of cruelty. It is being blocked by a nervous system doing the only thing it knows how to do with the threat of total self-condemnation. Where does this shame architecture come from? The research points consistently to early developmental experience, specifically to the quality of the environment in which the child first learned what it meant to make a mistake. In environments where mistakes were met with proportional behavior-focused responses, where a child who did something wrong was told that the behavior was wrong, experienced a consequence connected to the behavior, and then was received back into warmth and connection, the child learns a critical lesson. Mistakes are survivable. Wrongdoing is not the same as being wrong. The relationship can hold the information that I made a mistake without the relationship ending. In environments where mistakes were met with disproportionate shame responses, where a child who did something wrong was told, explicitly or implicitly, that they were bad, selfish, a disappointment, fundamentally deficient, the child learns a different lesson. Mistakes are not survivable in their full acknowledgement. Admitting fault does not produce repair, it produces annihilation. And the only protection from that annihilation is to not admit fault. Developmental psychologist Martin Hoffman documented this distinction across decades of research. The difference between what he called inductive discipline, explaining the impact of the behavior on others, keeping the target as the action, and power-assertive or love-withdrawing discipline, which makes the child's worth as a person contingent on their behavior. Children raised in the latter environment develop a shame-based response to wrongdoing rather than a guilt-based one, and that response, automatic, disproportionate, and organized around self-protection rather than repair, follows them into adulthood with remarkable consistency. The shame defense architecture produces 3 specific behavioral patterns in adult relationships, each of which is a different form of the same underlying avoidance. The first is what researchers call externalization. Rather than acknowledging the harm caused, the person redirects responsibility outward. Your reaction is the problem. Your sensitivity is the problem. The circumstances that made them behave that way are the problem. The pattern of behavior that has produced repeated harm over time is never the problem. because acknowledging the pattern would require acknowledging something about the self that the system cannot afford to examine. Externalization is not always loud. It does not always take the form of counterattack. It can be quiet and reasonable sounding. I was under a lot of pressure. You know I didn't mean it that way. You're reading into this. The structure is the same regardless of the delivery. The responsibility is being moved away from the self before it can land. The second is minimization. The harm is acknowledged in its smallest possible form, enough to technically constitute an acknowledgement, not enough to actually require the full weight of responsibility. I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry if what I said upset you. Both of these constructions contain the word sorry. Neither of them contains an acknowledgement of having caused harm. The passive construction, if that you feel, positions the harm as located in the other person's response rather than in the action that produced it. The third is what clinicians call DARVO, a term developed by psychologist Jennifer Freyd: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. The person who caused harm denies the harm, attacks the credibility of the person who was harmed, and repositions themselves as the actual victim of the interaction. The confrontation intended to produce accountability becomes, through this maneuver, evidence of the confronting person's aggression. The person seeking an apology is now the one who owes an apology. The person who caused harm is now the one who has been wronged. DARVO is not consciously strategic in most cases. It is the shame defense system operating at full capacity, doing whatever is necessary to prevent the examination of the foundation. There is a significant overlap between the shame defense architecture we have been examining and the narcissistic personality structure, and it is worth being precise about the relationship between them. Narcissistic personality organization, as the research now broadly understands it, is not primarily a structure of genuine self-inflation. It is a structure of shame management. The grandiose self, the superior, exceptional, entitled self that narcissism presents to the world, is built on top of a foundational experience of deficiency and shame and functions as a cover for it. The entitlement is the system's claim that it should never have to examine the foundation. The rage at criticism is the system's response when someone gets close to it. This is why people with narcissistic traits are so systematically unable to apologize. The apology is not merely unpleasant, it is existentially threatening. It requires the temporary dismantling of the grandiose self, the admission of ordinary human fallibility, and the direct contact with what is underneath it. For a system that has been organized entirely around preventing that contact, the apology is not a social gesture. It is the one thing the entire architecture was built to prevent. This does not mean everyone who cannot apologize has a narcissistic personality structure. The shame defense architecture exists on a spectrum, but it does explain why the inability to apologize is such a consistent and prominent feature of narcissistic presentation, and why attempts to obtain accountability from someone in that structure through logic, emotional appeal, or the escalation of evidence reliably fail. You are not dealing with a person who has evaluated the evidence and reached a wrong conclusion. You are dealing with a system that cannot allow the evaluation to occur. The shame defense architecture is among the more treatment-resistant patterns in clinical psychology, but the research is consistent that it can shift under specific conditions and with a specific understanding of what the shift actually requires. The standard approach, confronting the person with evidence of harm, appealing to their empathy, expressing the impact of their behavior, is the approach most likely to activate the defense rather than bypass it. It approaches the foundation directly, and the system responds to direct approach with fortification. What the research identifies as more effective is the indirect approach. Specifically, the creation of conditions in which the shame defense system is gradually rendered less necessary. 3 mechanisms show consistent results. The first is the experience of accountability without annihilation. Typically in a therapeutic relationship in which wrongdoing can be examined without the total condemnation the system was trained to expect. The person discovers incrementally that acknowledging a harmful action does not produce the catastrophic self-collapse the system has been organized to prevent, that the foundation can be examined, that it holds. The self-concept proves more resilient than the system believed. The second is the deliberate cultivation of guilt rather than shame, learning to target the behavior rather than the person in self-evaluation. Researchers including Tangney and Brené Brown have both documented that this reorientation from "I am bad" to "I did something bad" is learnable, and that it is the specific cognitive shift that allows accountability to become possible without triggering the full shame defense cascade. The third is relational safety over time. The shame defense system was built in an environment where accountability produced punishment. It updates slowly in environments where accountability produces repair, where admitting fault is met not with the confirmation of worthlessness but with the restoration of connection. The nervous system learns, through repeated experience, not through argument, that the apology does not destroy the self, that the foundation was never as unstable as it seemed. This is slow work. It cannot be forced from the outside. And for many people in relationships with someone who has this architecture, it requires the honest assessment of whether the conditions for that shift are present, whether the relationship itself is the environment where it could occur, and whether waiting for an apology that the system currently cannot produce is a cost worth paying. If you have been waiting for an apology that has not come, if you have presented the evidence, expressed the impact, appealed to the history you share with this person, and been met with deflection or counter-accusation or a silence that has no end, this is what the research says. The apology is probably not being withheld because you don't matter enough to receive it. It is more likely being blocked by a system that experiences the apology as a threat. It is not equipped to survive. That is not your failure, and it is not precisely a character flaw in the ordinary sense of that phrase. It is an architecture, built early, under specific conditions, for a reason that made sense at the time, that has been running the same defensive program ever since. Understanding this does not obligate you to accept behavior that harms you. It does not mean the harm was less real. It does not mean you should stop needing the acknowledgement you need. It means you can stop asking the question that has no answer from inside the pattern you are dealing with. Why won't they just say it? They cannot say it. Not yet. Possibly not ever. Without conditions that may not exist in your relationship. The system that blocks the apology is older and more powerful than the relationship, older than the specific harm, older than anything you could say or do or demonstrate to change it. And knowing that, knowing where the block actually lives, is the beginning of deciding what to do with the time you have been spending waiting for a door that is, from the inside, sealed shut. If the mechanisms we examine here are useful to you, the archive has more than 30 episodes covering patterns like this one at the level of the documented research. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. We'll see you in the next one.